This is a critique of Dr. Shabir Ali's Markian theory, and the theory goes basically something like Mark was the earliest gospel, and you have Matthew, Luke, Matthew, whatever order he prefers, I don't really care, and then John at the end. And when you compare the Christology, it emerges, it escalates throughout the Gospels. And so Jesus begins as this prophet, a simple prophet in first century Palestine in Mark, and then by the time you get to John, you have God in the flesh. That's the theory, the argument that Dr. Shabir Ali advances in his critique of Christian theology. Now, Shabir is able to do this because for one, he's an Islamic polemicist against Christianity, and so it's his job to distort the text however he wants. But he does this for a second reason, or he's able to do this for a second reason. The second reason is that he doesn't know the Old Testament. The best commentary on the New Testament is the Old Testament. Now, how far does one get in the Gospel of Mark before one is thrown back into the Old Testament? You get past the introduction. And then immediately Mark throws you back to Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3. Now, this is, of course, in addition to numerous other quotations and allusions throughout the Gospel of Mark to the Old Testament. So let's examine Mark's portrayal of Jesus. As I said, Mark refers to Isaiah 40, verse 3, and Malachi 3:1. Now, Mark refers to both of these as quotations from the prophet Isaiah. They're conflated, as I said, between Malachi and Isaiah. This was not unusual for them to do. Whatever reason, it doesn't make sense to us, but it was fine with them to conflate a quote and attribute it to the major prophet. They thought it was okay. If you don't, well, get used to it. The text reads, "I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him." So both of these references are in the context of preparing for the way of the Lord. Now, Lord in the Old Testament, of course, is the God of Israel, right? That's what the writers were referring to. Now think about the exilic period. The period of time when God had forsaken Israel. He had given them to other nations because they reverted to idolatry and all forms of wickedness. These were the times when those who still had allegiance to Yahweh were asking questions like, when is our Lord going to return? When is he going to come back? And you find speculation along this narrative all through Second Temple literature as well. Now, it's very important to notice what Mark does. He takes this theme of the coming of the Lord and preparing the way for him, and he applies it to Jesus. So for Mark, what does the coming of the Lord of Israel of the Old Testament look like? It looks like Jesus in first century Palestine. So immediately upon opening the Gospel of Mark, one is thrown back into the Old Testament, referring to the preparation and the coming of the Lord, the God of Israel. And Mark says, that's Jesus. So that's how the Gospel of Mark starts out. What about later in Mark? Let me read another text. Mark 14:62, Jesus says, "You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Jesus says this in the context of his conversation with Caiaphas. Jesus is being questioned or interrogated by the high priest Caiaphas, and he gives this response to one of Caiaphas' questions. Now, scholars debate the title Son of Man. It's how should I say this? It is the most contested title of Jesus in the Gospels. Now, what it means in this particular context, I don't really care. It's obviously an allusion to Daniel 7. Many people want to take the title Son of Man to be an expression of Jesus' humanity. Fine. Again, I don't care. Let's take Son of Man and understand it to be Jesus claiming to be fully human. Not a problem. The next thing Jesus says is extremely important for our purposes. He refers to sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, where are we to go to understand what Jesus is talking about? You guessed it, the Old Testament. Ugaritic texts teach us that Baal, a very well-known god of the ancient people, was given various titles. Now, in the ancient world, titles were functions. The more functions you had, the more powerful of a god you were, the more titles you had. Now, one of Baal's titles was the Cloud Rider. Very interesting. And it sounds kind of cool, the Cloud Rider. And the Hebrews liked it. They liked that title. And as they did with other mythology and various literary motifs floating around in the day, they would adopt them and put them into their own texts. And that's what they did. They agreed with this motif of the cloud rider to an extent. But for them, the cloud rider was not Baal. It was Yahweh. This is why in Psalm 68, the God of Israel rides across the highest heavens in contrast to Baal, and he rides upon a swift cloud in Isaiah 19, and again in contrast to Baal in Deuteronomy 33. There is no one like the God of Israel who rides across the heavens. So the Israelites said, yeah, we really like this theme, but it's not Baal, it's Yahweh. And Jesus, standing before Caiaphas, says, you know that cloud rider of the Old Testament? That's me. And so if Son of Man is to be understood as a human title, then Jesus is claiming in the same sentence in front of Caiaphas to be human and divine. And guess what? That's what Christian theology teaches anyway. Now, did Caiaphas understand what Jesus said? He tore his robe and said Jesus had blasphemed, and he sentenced him to death. Now, ironically, this is one of the few times that a leader of the Jewish people actually understood what Jesus was saying. Caiaphas, as the high priest, knew his text, and he knew that this motif of riding in the clouds was attributed to Yahweh, and Jesus had claimed it for himself. What's also ironic is that Caiaphas here, one of the few times a Jewish leader realized what Jesus was saying, is more in touch with what Jesus said than many modern Christians today. Many modern Christians can't defend this text because they don't understand what the text actually says. Jesus is claiming for himself a motif attributed to Yahweh in the Old Testament. And that's why Dr. Shabir Ali should drop his Markian theory, because I acknowledge the scholarly consensus that says Mark is the earliest gospel, but I have just demonstrated from the beginning of Mark's gospel and from a passage toward the end of Mark's gospel, the first being Mark's description of Jesus and the second being Jesus' description of himself, that you cannot get a higher Christology than that which is portrayed in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is on par with the God of Israel in Mark's gospel. And so Mark's early date, then, testifies to the fact that the Christology of Jesus Christ started out as high as it could possibly go. So yes, Shabir, Mark is the earliest gospel. I'm fine with that. Guess what? The Christology of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark cannot get any higher than it is. And by the way, there are plenty of places throughout the Gospel of Mark that, when properly illuminated by the, you guessed it, Old Testament, demonstrate that the deeds of Jesus and his sayings and where he is when he does and says things are explicit divine claims as well. You just have to know the Old Testament for this to make sense. Oh, but Jesus didn't have full knowledge, did he? Mark 13:32 refers to Jesus not knowing something. Only the Father knows. And so Jesus didn't have divine knowledge, so he wasn't God. In first century Palestine, when preparations for weddings were being made, everybody knew approximately when the wedding would occur. They had to travel, they had to prepare food. But the father, as the head of the household, reserved the right himself to say exactly when the preparations were complete and the wedding would specifically happen. And there was a colloquialism. If the son were asked, "When is your wedding?" he would say, "Only my Father knows." But everybody knew who was privy to the event. And Jesus is saying that this is just like eschatology, just like the end times. People who are looking for the event will know approximately when the event is, but they won't know exactly because that knowledge is not for them. And so Jesus compares eschatology to a wedding, and he uses a common colloquialism to explain to his disciples that the signs of a wedding are like the signs of the end times. And that's the answer to Mark 13. Did Christology develop throughout the Gospels then? No. Mark, as the earliest Gospel, puts the Christology of Jesus supremely high. It cannot get any higher. What develops throughout the Gospels is theology. John's theology is much more developed. Is this a surprise? The entire Bible, from start to finish, is a stage-by-stage development of theology. God revealing himself little by little, in small doses that we can take. So the Christology does not develop, but the theology does. And that's the answer to Dr. Shabir Ali's Markian theory. He needs to drop it because it backfires in his face, but only when you understand the best commentary on the New Testament, the Old Testament.